to 7. Now, the 2026 FIFA World Cup has reached the quarterfinal stage, as you may well know, with millions of fans around the world gripped by the action. But alongside the excitement, there are growing concerns about a rise in sports betting and gambling-related harm. Experts say the increasing popularity of online betting platforms and around-the-clock access to gambling are putting more people at risk. To discuss these concerns, I'm joined now by Lebogang Seoheng, who is the Communication, Advocacy and Prevention Manager at the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation. A very good morning to you, Lebogang, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good morning, Tipis, and good morning to the Channel Africa listeners.
Are you able to quantify at this stage how much money has gone into whether being played or being won since the FIFA World Cup began?
Tippy, so when it comes to the quantifying of the money, obviously that we don't do as an institution. What the provincial gambling boards do, who are the issuers of licenses of these online betting companies, would then look at towards the end of the tournament, the gross gambling revenue and the total revenue that was generated during the FIFA World Cup. And they would be able to give us a better indicator in terms of how much was wagered during this period and how much was paid out in winnings and how much gross gambling revenue was generated during this period. But from the South African Responsible Gambling's perspective, what we are seeing now in terms of our toll-free counseling line is people that are calling us not necessarily for help for problem gambling or excessive gambling, but they're calling us because they can't access their accounts, they want to check their FICA documents, they're having issues with their apps. And usually what we do as a toll-free helpline is that we usually feel the ramifications of excessive gambling and problem gambling 2 or 3 months after a major sporting tournament. So we should revisit this discussions in the next 2 to 3 months, where we'll be able to give you an indicator in terms of numbers of people that have come through with a gambling problem or a gambling addiction post the FIFA World Cup.
And I guess I am just trying to understand then why there are concerns about this being a public health risk. What are the trends that you've been seeing, particularly in sports betting and gambling related harm, as you say?
Yes, look, it is concerning because we've seen over the years, since 2019, 2020, when we went into lockdown because of the COVID-19 restrictions, we saw movement or popularity in terms of the preferred mode of gambling moving from land-based onto online. And we've seen a subsequent growth year on year, specifically on sports betting, which makes up about 70% of the revenue that is generated in the gambling industry. So this the betting side and the sports betting side of wagering and betting has grown significantly and continues to grow year on year. Now, because we are part of the gambling ecosystem where we provide therapeutic treatment and counseling to those that are affected by gambling harm, problem gambling or gambling addiction, we also then steadily start to see an increase of those that have got problem gambling and gambling addiction. Because remember, a lot of people don't understand that gambling addiction is a mental health disorder. Which affects obviously the brain, which affects how we behave. It looks at the dopamine and how the neurotransmitters are triggered when they are engaging in this activity, and usually also comes with other comorbidity conditions, which is excessive use of substance abuse and also other psychological and clinical comorbidity conditions. So we always encourage people to screen themselves using the self-screening tool known as the Problem Gambling Severity Index, so they're able to know and get an indicator where they are sitting on the gambling continuum.
And I'm just looking at the fact that according to figures, particularly football, or rather sports, it accounts for 70% of South Africa's gambling market. At what point does it cease being an entertainment issue and then it becoming a gambling related harm?
Where the scale starts to tip, Tippy, so is we usually like to use this example. You either have an extra 50 Rand to wager or the last 50 Rand to wager. Now, once you take that 50 Rand and it's the last 50 Rand to wager, that's when it starts to become problematic because there is no guarantee that you're going to win back that 50 Rand and more. And then that 50 Rand you were meant to be using for, other financial commitments. And then what people then start doing is they start chasing losses, they start getting into debt, they start borrowing money, and then they start getting into the cycle. Once they start getting into that financial cycle, they start to get into a psychological mental health breakdown cycle as well as that process is unfolding. So usually how we make a distinguisher between when it stops becoming fun and starts becoming harmful is when you now start taking that last 50 Rand as opposed to that extra 50 Rand to wager.
So, one of the more troubling findings, I believe, is that there is a sharp increase in suicidal ideation amongst people seeking help. Can this be directly related? Or is there a correlation with gambling?
Yes, definitely. From those that have called us in, there's definitely is a correlation because when we do the intake of those that call for help, we do a psychiatric evaluation or the psychiatric metric that we use together with the problem gambling severity index to measure not only the prevalence of the problem, but then the severity of the problem. And again, going back to the fact that gambling addiction is a mental health disorder, which does impact the neurological pathway in our brain, which impacts our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making and impulse control, because there is an extended, increased excretion of dopamine in our brain. And what the dopamine does, it builds tolerance. And again, hence, as I'm explaining some of these concepts very basically for you and the listeners, that then translate the mood and behavior. And again, when moods and behavior are not sitting at a positive stage and a negative stage, and people can't get themselves out of the cycle of gambling addiction and their financial, they then sink into depression and anxiety and other comorbidity conditions. And then that also then results in suicide ideation because they just can't get themselves out of the situation that they find themselves in of gambling addiction. So it's very important to seek treatment and again to screen themselves using the problem gambling severity index or the screening tool so that they always know where they start falling in the gambling continuum because it starts off with low levels, then it goes into moderate, and then it goes into severe. And severe is usually the ones, the cases that we find that have a lot of suicide ideation.
And just looking at the support services that are involved, because you were saying, and I found it very interesting in how you're explaining it, it's either you're playing do extra 50 or you last 50. But some people, to actually realize that they are treading on very dangerous ground, because I mean I've seen colleagues actually gamble while we've been on air, and it clearly is so consuming. So how do people know that they have a problem if they don't go directly to a formal support structure, so to speak, that has to deal with gambling?
So once people find, if without before coming to us, everybody knows their individual selves when they are being totally distracted. I mean, as you're saying, if you've got colleagues where you're on air and they're busy on their cell phones, it means they are being distracted from what they are meant to be doing, and those are usually the signs. They usually become socially isolated. Their behavior and their mood starts to change. They usually are very kind of isolate themselves socially. They start lying in certain instances and they start borrowing quite a lot of money. So the behavioral patterns begin to change. And it's at that point where it now starts to become a secret and isolated, because it's not like substance abuse addiction. You can physically see if somebody is induced with a substance, whereas gambling is quite secretive. So I think it's very important, as I say, for people to always screen themselves as they engage in this activity, so that they're able to see where they sit in the gambling continuing, and also understand that, it can be addictive. The mere fact that it's so accessible, similarly to social media, that social media can be very, very addictive. It's to put times and boundaries for yourself in terms of, I'm only going to spend 2 hours on the betting app, and once that 2 hours has depleted and I've got a budget of 100 Rand, and if that 100 Rand is depleted, then I stop. So it's also about self-control as well. But again, re-emphasizing that, again, there's a lot of things that are happening in the neurological pathway in our brains that obviously alter the feeling that we want to feel. And, a lot of studies and research, especially in psychology, have said that, the winning of gambling is about 10 times higher. It releases 10 times more dopamine in your system. And that obviously then kind of rewards the behavior and the feeling as well. So it's very important for people to screen themselves as often as they can if they are engaging in betting and gambling.
Okay, so any advice to anybody who still wants to enjoy the fever of the World Cup by, supporting their team and betting against the odds?
Absolutely. My advice would be wager and bet with money that you can afford. So when you have that extra 50 Rand and not your last 50 Rand. And another piece of advice I would give them is that it's a game of chance. The game can go either way. There is no guarantee. So also have that in mind, that there is a 50% chance of winning and a 50% chance of losing.
All right. Thank you so
And
much
we do
for
welcome
speaking
people to seek help.
All right. Lebogang, just speaking about the dangers of gambling, and gambling obviously as a public health harm, where people are using funds that they don't have to, bet against their favorite team, which is bet against the odds. Lebogang Seoheng is Communication, Advocacy and Prevention Manager at the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation. Brings the time to 7 o'clock. Time now for your news with Joalani Tulongweb.
SABC News. The African Perspective.
Thank you, Tsepiso. Good morning. Tunisia is facing renewed international scrutiny after courts handed down lengthy prison sentences to several prominent human rights defenders